I'm Lauren Summers. I'm Senior Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel at the Yale Alumni Association, here on behalf of the Yale Alumni Academy program. And I'm really excited about this presentation. It's the first one we've done in a little while, but I think very exciting, sharing some opportunities for you all to get connected to something really new and innovative that Mark has brought to the Yale campus. I'm going to introduce Mark and then we're going to get going. I also want to say that this presentation is being recorded. So if you don't want your name to appear in the recording, we'll cut off the introduction section when we post the recording. But if you continue to comment in the chat, your name will appear in the chat and you can change your name as it's listed in the chat. You can do that on your Zoom settings if you care about that in terms of the recording. So here we are for the multi-generational moment, how generations can come together to solve problems, bridge divides, and co-create a better future for everyone. Our co-host for this presentation is Executive Education at the Yale School of Management. Our presenter is Mark Friedman, who is lecturer in the practice of management and faculty director of the Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Mark, and then I'm going to pass it to him to get the presentation going. Mark is also in addition to his role at Yale, he's also a co-CEO and founder of Cogenerate, formerly Encore, and he is the author of 5 books. The Wall Street Journal has named his most recent book, How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting the Generations, as one of the year's best books on aging well. He was selected as Social Entrepreneur of the Year by the Schwab Foundation and World Economic Forum. He's a winner of the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and he is an Ashoka Senior Fellow. He's formerly a visiting scholar at the Stanford Center on Longevity, but we've got him now at Yale. Lucky us, too bad for you, Stanford. And he is the originator of the Encore career idea, which is all about linking second acts to the greater good. Friedman co-founded Experience Corps, the Purpose Prize, and Encore Fellowships. And if you're not familiar with those things, I really encourage you to look them up and learn more about them. All fascinating work, which we are going to hear more about from you, Mark. Last thing I'll say before I hand off to you is if you have questions, we're going to have time for a conversation at the end. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. It's much easier to keep track and make sure we've answered everyone through the Q&A box. If you post in the chat, though, please feel free to answer each other's questions as the presentation goes on. And without any further ado, Mark, you're on. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the Yale Alumni Academy and Lisa Pfeiffer Chapman, who helped facilitate this. And also to all of you who are tuning in today, including my good friend Joe Zollner. That was great to see your note. Today's going to be a buy one, get one free, actually get 2 free, but I am going to spend the second half of the conversation talking about the title, about the multi-generational moment and what we're experiencing as a society with a unique generational configuration. But I thought I would precede that by talking about the ways that we're rewriting the life course, because I think it leads directly into that topic. And also, it gives me a chance to tackle 2, I wouldn't say myths or misconceptions, but incomplete readings of the demographic phenomenon that's in front of us. The first is the idea that we're having a society that is primarily defined by longevity, as important as longevity is. And the second is around the aging. society. And I want to argue that the most significant things going on are the rewriting of the map of life and the tremendous age diversity that we're facing as a society. And I thought I would begin that first topic by recounting a story. As Lauren mentioned, I was a fellow at the Stanford Center on Longevity, which is a wonderful place. I live in Berkeley, and I would drive down on a near daily basis. It was that era when people actually went into offices. And when I would go over the San Francisco Bay Bridge heading towards Stanford and Silicon Valley, invariably I would pass by this billboard from Prudential, which said the first person to live to 150 has already been born. And the tagline was prepare for a longer retirement. And if you read the fine print, essentially it was arguing that retirement age is 65, and that if you do that math, it means preparing for an 85-year retirement. And as somebody who has spent the bulk of their career in the nonprofit sector, the idea of saving for a retirement that is 8+ decades in duration was a bit daunting. And en route to Silicon Valley, I was passing the headquarters of Oracle and many other tech companies where billions were being spent on going beyond 150, essentially living forever, which is where the title of my last book came from. Larry Ellison, the founder of and CEO of Oracle, was quoted around that time in, I think, the Wall Street Journal, saying he was contemptuous of the idea of death. To which Michael Kinsley, a Yale alum, and at that point writing in The Atlantic, said, it matters a lot less what Larry Ellison thinks of death than what death thinks of Larry Ellison, which immediately became one of my favorite lines. But, in this focus on longevity in living longer, as I was saying earlier, I think we're missing the new map of life that's being constructed to go with this new length of life. And in particular, and what I wanted to focus on in the first part today, is the emergence of an entirely new, as of yet unnamed stage of life that's taking shape between the middle years and anything resembling old age and retirement. That idea of inventing stages of life, might sound counterintuitive. I mean, it seems like life stages are natural phenomenon, like the oxygen in the air. But in fact, they're social constructions. We didn't have childhood in this country before the middle of the 19th century. We used to dress children like little adults and expect them to act accordingly. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a population explosion of young people who weren't quite children. They weren't yet adults. We were worried that they had physical maturity, but emotional immaturity. And we decided to create a new stage of life called adolescence. In 1906, G. Stanley Hall, who was the father of American psychology, wrote a 1,000-page book. He was 60 himself when he wrote this book, with the title Adolescence, and essentially put this stage of life on the map. Hall was a remarkable figure. I said he was the father of psychology in America, and I'm not exaggerating. He's the first PhD in psychology. He founded the American Psychological Association. He founded the American Journal of Psychology. In fact, he was the person who brought Freud and Jung to America when he was president of Clark University. And he had Freud and Jung and William James living in a little house at Clark for a period of weeks, playing Ouija. It's an incredible story. But I bring up Hall because 20 years after inventing adolescence, he was 80, and he essentially said, I made a big mistake. I shouldn't have invented teenagers. I should have invented a new stage of life between midlife and old age. And he had been the class poet at Williams College. And so in addition to being an accomplished psychologist, he was also someone with a great facility for language. And he described this period of life, this new stage between midlife and old age, as an Indian summer. And he said that human beings didn't reach the height of their capacity until the shadows started slanting eastward. What a beautiful phrase. And I've thought about it a lot. And I think what Paul was driving at is that there's a sweet spot in life, this Indian summer, where people have the benefit of experience and the time to do something with that. I almost think of it as three dimensions of time that are intersecting: time lived, time left to live, and the time beyond our lives. And now, fast forward 100 years since Paul described this Indian summer, we've got, just like we had in the early part of the 20th century with a population explosion of adolescents, we've got a population explosion of people who are flooding into this new stage that has no name. I think there are 12,000 people a day who are turning 65. I turned 65 myself last year, so I'm very much part of that migration. And it's a period that not only lacks a name, but is bereft of the kinds of institutions that you would want to move into an entirely new stage of life. Imagine if we had no higher education system. We just expected adolescents to become adulthoods through they become adults through some magical process. And it reminds me, and particularly in the realm of work, of a quote from Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of myths. Campbell said, "Midlife is when you get to the top of the ladder and discover it's leaning against the wrong wall." And we, as Lauren mentioned, and our organization have been promoting the idea of an encore career, a second act for the greater good. And we did a study a few years ago in which we discovered that already 4.5 million Americans were moving into these second acts for the greater good in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. 20 million more gave doing so top priority. And when we asked them how long they envision this period of life and work and contribution lasting, they said 10 years. So if you bring together the 4.5 million, the 20 million, the 10 years, you get 250 million years of human and social capital that could be dedicated to helping to alleviate some of the biggest problems facing society. And yet the transition into this period is very much a do-it-yourself process. And I want to throw out for our discussion later on how we can create better pathways to purpose in the second half of life. Our organization created something called the Encore Fellowship, which is a 1-year, 1,000-hour internship for grown-ups, essentially, where people coming from various backgrounds, including the private sector, are moving into work in NGOs and nonprofits and other social impact organizations, and doing it at the intersection of their experience, but the opportunity to apply that experience to a new challenge. So if you were working on marketing at Intel, you might go and work for the Boys and Girls Club, but in a marketing capacity, so that there's a blend of comfort and adventure. And then the second development, which I'm really excited about, is the invention of a new kind of school for the second half of life. Joseph Campbell's mentor, Carl Jung, in 1929 wrote an essay, I guess after he had escaped from that house in Worcester, Massachusetts with Freud and William James and the Ouija board, called The Stages of Life. And in it, he asked a question. He said, that we can't live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. Essentially, if we try to pretend that we're still young and have those same aspirations that we did when we were young, things weren't going to go well. And then he asked, where are the schools for people moving into the afternoon of life, for people in their 50s and 60s? We've got colleges for people in their 20s, but not for people at this other important life transition. And again, just like G. Stanley Hall, he was writing this at a time when we had a relatively small number of people who were living into that period. And today we're awash in people who need help in making that transition. So I want to talk about what we could do to make that possible. Tim, who's on the call, is at the Notre Dame Inspired Leadership Initiative, which is an absolutely wonderful program in and of itself. And it's accompanied by a whole collection of Encore education programs. When I came to the Yale School of Management in 1982, it was to work with Rosabeth Cantor, the management scholar. She left to go to Harvard Business School, and then after teaching for 30 plus years, she created the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative 15 years ago. There's a similar program at Stanford, the Distinguished Careers Institute at the University of Chicago, the Leadership and Society Initiative. And now we're at the doorstep of creating Yale's incarnation of that program, which I can talk about later as well. Turns out if you call it the Experienced Leaders Initiative, it's the Yale Eli Fellows Program, which will open its doors in January of 2025. And as part of this trend that I'm extremely excited about around creating pathways to this new period in life. We still have to come up with a name. When I was writing a book about the invention of this stage, I asked my estimable mother-in-law if she had any ideas for this period of life. And she said, oh, yes, I already I have a suggestion for that. She said she's on her next to last dog. So, we're used to talking about dog years. So maybe there's a canine name for this period. I got very nervous because her dog died, but she's still with us and doing well. I want to stop with this first part, which is essentially an argument that as we think about longevity, we really need to go more deeply into this new map of life, and particularly this period taking shape in the latter part of life. I think there's this misconception that as we've added all these years to life expectancy in 1900 was 47. Today it's over 80. We've essentially added more years in the past 125 years to the lifespan than we did in all the previous millennia up to that point. So this is a radical change, but it's contributing to a deeply substantive rethinking of what a life looks like and what its chapters are. But the second part of the talk, and the part that was advertised as the title of the talk, is on our multi-generational future. And that's something that I'm working on through my role at Cogenerate, nonprofit these days. And my interest in the question of multi-generational relations actually grows out of the early part of my career. When I came out of the Yale School of Management, I started a program called Experience Corps, which was designed to be a Peace Corps for older people, focused on helping children read by the third grade. I did that project in conjunction with John Gardner, who was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He's the person who implemented Medicare. He was 50 years older than I was when we started Experience Corps, and was a wonderful mentor. And the idea of Experience Corps grew out of a period when there were enormous opportunities being created for young people to serve. Teach for America, City Year. And I felt that there needed to be equivalent opportunities for this vast and growing older population. And Experience Corps, which is now run by AARP, turned out to be a very effective way to help young people read by the third grade. There's research on it from Johns Hopkins Medical School and from Washington University in St. Louis that shows that for young people, involvement in Experience Corps is the equivalent of cutting class size in half in terms of the educational benefits. But some of the strongest benefits have been for the older people themselves who've been in the program. Johns Hopkins Medical School recently came out with research that shows that participation in Experience Corps reverses the preconditions of dementia. It's through the social connectedness that people have in the program, through the sense of purpose, the exercise that the program involves. And as the research results started trickling in from Hopkins and Wash U and other places, naturally we were overjoyed, but it also raised another question about why this doesn't just happen naturally. The Experience Corps members were oftentimes in the same communities as the schools and the children they were working with. Why did we even need programs like Experience Corps? And that set me down a path that continues to be of deep interest and that I'm eager to talk to you about, which is the answer to that question of why it doesn't happen naturally is that we've thwarted it systematically over the last century. We've thwarted these generational connections. America began the 20th century as one of the most age-integrated societies in the world. In fact, in some ways, we were age irrelevant. We in the 19th century, people didn't know how old they were. Birthdays weren't celebrated. Knowing somebody's age would be like knowing somebody's blood type today. You'd never even think to ask. And every institution of society, every aspect of daily life was thoroughly integrated by age. People lived in multi-generational households. They worked in an agrarian economy where older and younger people were side by side. Even the one-room schoolhouse of yore had 4-year-olds and 50-year-olds learning the alphabet side by side. And then it all changed in the 20th century. We undertook one of the most radical experiments in social reorganization that's ever been attempted. And we reorganized society by age, but it was not a nefarious plot. It was something in many ways that came about as the result of progressive reforms. Child labor laws, universal schooling led young people to be separated out and spend their days in the company of other young people. Social Security, to my mind, the great social policy triumph of the last century, but it had as an explicit goal one of its explicit goals, getting older people out of the workforce at a time when we had over 20% youth unemployment and we needed to create space for young people. And then one after another, with spectacular creativity, we invented a set of institutions for older people where they were located with other older people. Nursing homes, retirement communities, senior centers, lifelong learning programs. One after another, older people became congregated with other older people in housing and in community activities. The turning point was in the 1950s, a point when older people were really on the margins of society, even as their numbers were growing. Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, got up in front of his union in 1948 and described older people as too old to work, too young to die. Another scholar of aging of the day described later life as a role-less role. And Louis Mumford, the New Yorker's architectural critic, who turned 60 in 1956, wrote a cover story in Architectural Record and argued that at no point in any society had any group been so rejected as older people today. And in this article, Mumford said, we've got to fix that, especially as the number of older people was growing. And the title of the article laid out his prescription. It was for older people, not segregation, integration. And that very same year, 1956, when Mumford's architectural record article and appeal came out, the very first retirement community in America was opened. And again, just like a lot of the other reforms that contributed to age segregation, the opening of this community was an idealistic effort. A real estate developer named Ben Schleifer in Phoenix had gone to visit an older friend in New York State who was isolated in a nursing home, alone, living an utterly purposeless life. And he decided to do something about it. And he opened a community outside of Peoria, Arizona, with the name Youngtown. And the idea was that for older people around the country who were rejected, in a country that was obsessed with adolescents, youth, teenagers, there was a place they could go and be young again. And if everybody was old, nobody was old. The program captured the national imagination, and an entrepreneur by the name of Del Webb watched a morning TV show featuring Youngtown and decided this was the future. And he opened the first Sun City directly across the street from Youngtown in Peoria, Arizona. And when Sun City opened on January 1st, 1960, 100,000 people showed up. There was a 22-mile traffic jam of older people from all over the country who came to the outskirts of godforsaken Phoenix desert of 1960, nothing compared to the Phoenix of today, to live a new way of life. Webb was the person who coined the phrase the golden years. And communities like Sun City have contributed enormously to the segregation of older people. In the last census, the villages in Florida, a latter-day version of Sun City, was the fastest growing metropolitan area in America. And so we started the 20th century as one of the most age-integrated societies in the world. We ended it as the most age-segregated. Andrew Scott, author of The 100-Year Life and a professor at London Business School, describes us as being in a state of age apartheid. It's probably no surprise in a state of age apartheid that there is generational conflict. It's probably no surprise that ageism up and down the life cycle is rampant. And Becca Levy, professor at Yale, has shown in her book, Breaking the Age Code, that older people who have ageist attitudes, who have negative views of their own aging, live 7.5 years fewer than people who have positive attitudes towards aging. Not 7.5 months, 7.5 years. And it's probably no surprise that not only is there conflict and ageism, but loneliness and isolation. The New York Times just featured a study that shows that we're in the midst of a loneliness curve. The two most lonely and isolated groups in society are young people and older people. And Vivek Murthy, a graduate of Yale School of Medicine and the Yale School of Management, has put the significance as Surgeon General of loneliness on the national map, showing that being socially isolated is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of health. So we need to turn this trend towards age segregation around, and we need to do it in part because of the negative consequences, but also it's a missed opportunity of staggering proportions. And I'll talk in the discussion, if people are interested, about the developmental needs of older and younger people and how they fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And there's also significant research from evolutionary anthropology that we were meant to connect across generational lines. In fact, anthropologists now believe that the reason we became human beings in the first place was because of the role grandmothers played. But we need to do it also because of the second demographic trend that I mentioned earlier. We are now the most age diverse society that's ever lived. In 1900, when people were living to 47, if you looked at the distribution of the population by age from 0 to 75, it's a downhill slope. If you look at those same numbers from 0 to 75 in 2024, it's a flat line. We have the same number of 57-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 32-year-olds and 71-year-olds. Not only that, a quarter of the population is under 20 and a quarter of the population is over 60. So I want to argue that age diversity and age segregation are a very poor fit. Again, not only for the problems that that mismatch fuels, but for the opportunity that's being missed. And I think in closing, I want to strike an optimistic note because I'm seeing signs of change in many areas. There's been a fourfold increase in multi-generational housing. I think that it's an example of human resilience in action. There has been a wave of storytelling in popular culture that is showing the possibilities of generational connection and collaboration. I don't know how many of you watched the Grammys this past year, which featured Luke Combs and Tracy Chapman doing a duet of Fast Car, a song that Tracy Chapman wrote a year before Luke Combs was born. Then Joni Mitchell and Brandi Carlile, and following in the footsteps of Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga. If you switch from music to television, if you watch the Emmys this year or any of the last few years, you'll see shows like Hacks and Only Murders in the Building and Reservation Dogs, which are focused on cross-generational relations. And I'm enormously heartened by research that we just completed with the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, which shows that this phenomenon is not just something that's happening in housing or on TV, but that older and younger people have a deep interest in working together on the leading problems of the day. Older people want to work with younger people on climate and environmental issues. Younger people want to work with older people on mental health. Both groups want to collaborate on improving education. One of the striking findings of this research is, as an older person, I often think, do young people want to work with me? And I know other older people feel that way. Well, there was twice the level of interest on the part of young people, and the strongest interest of all in these cross-generational collaborations were from young people of color. And the message that was coming from these young people, I think, between the lines of data was, you older people can't create these problems, then pat us on the back and say, go solve them. But second, no one generation can solve any of these problems on their own, that this is going to require everybody coming together across difference, including difference of age. So I'll just close with a story that I think captures what the stakes are on the generational front in this new era of age diversity. I went back to the Arizona desert after spending many months there years ago, going to places like Youngtown and Sun City and trying to understand how we had created this idea of a golden years retirement. I went back last year to Tempe, Arizona, because I'd heard about a new housing development for older people that was being opened at the edge of the Arizona State University campus, one of the most innovative higher education institutions in the country. And when ground was broken for this community called Mirabella, Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, described it as, said it's going to be the coolest dorm in the world. And even with the pandemic, it quickly filled up with education and lifelong learning loving elders, including Michael Crow's predecessor, the former president of Arizona State University. Everything was going great. And then the pandemic receded, and it turns out that right across the street from Mirabella on East University Avenue in Tempe is the most beloved electronic music club in that city, Shady Park. And Shady Park starts playing music at midnight. And soon the windows were rattling at Mirabella, and the older people were telling the younger people to turn their damn music down, and the lawsuits started flying. The Wall Street Journal covered this generational war over music. The Chronicle of Higher Education featured it. And so I wanted to go and find out what was happening. And when I got to Mirabella, I discovered that something else was going on as well. On the second floor of the housing development was an intergenerational music utopia. There were older music lovers and young musicians of color who were living side by side as an experiment that Mirabella was conducting, that was at the intersection of proximity, older and younger people living side by side, shared purpose. These were all people who loved music, and also partnership. I spent time with a young Korean Canadian pianist named Michelle Kim, who's now a fellow at Yale in the music department, who had given up the flute when she decided to focus on piano. And her partnership with a 70-year-old retired lawyer from New York, Emily Ziegler, who'd given up the flute when she had to focus on the demands of being a lawyer. And the two became a flute duet and have become a phenomenon in Tempe. And I felt like Mirabella showed, with its battle with Shady Park, the potential discord of our multi-generational society, and also the harmony that's possible in these connections between generations. And so I think that's going to be one of the big questions for us as a society as we become even more multi-generational. Whether this is going to be something that brings us together or splits us apart. So I'll close with my twofer about the new stage of life and how we can navigate our multi-generational future, and hope have the opportunity to talk with you about these issues and other ones that have come up.
All right, thank you, Mark. That was fantastic and really interesting. I love the preamble, actually. Thank you for giving us a twofer. That was fantastic to get both stories. And the one thing that you didn't talk a lot about, which I will now prompt you to talk about, is the Experienced Leaders Initiative, in terms of if folks are interested in that or know people who are in this yet unnamed next act of life that would be a good fit for a program at Yale. If you could just give us for a minute or two just the highlights of what they could be looking forward to if they applied and were accepted to that program. I have put the link to the program website in the chat for those of you who want to know more about it. Please check it out. I believe the deadline that's coming up to apply is November 13th. So yeah, if you could just, I mean, this is going to be the first cohort, right?
It is, and it's going to be a pioneering cohort because, as I was talking about before, Lauren, we got a new length of life, we got a new map of life. We need better pathways to purpose that's distributed across this new life course. We need school for the second half of life. And that movement has taken hold at places like Notre Dame, Chicago, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford just started a new program. But we need more options. One of the challenges in a number of the other programs is cost, and fellows need to be residential. And so in thinking about the Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative, we've come up with a hybrid model, which we think complements the offerings that currently exist, which will be a fraction of the cost of these other initiatives, be 6 months in duration, and be a hybrid between time on campus and virtual learning in between. So people will come to Yale at the beginning and the end of the 6 months, but they'll be part of a cohort that's meeting online throughout the period between those in-person get-togethers. And the program is divided into 3 pillars, which we've been describing as looking inward, looking outward, and moving forward. And the reason we pick those 3 pillars, which in other ways I think of as who, what, and how. Who are we going to be in this next phase of life, which is partly defined by what we're going to do, but also this is a developmental shift every bit as much as a vocational one. What are our priorities? What's our purpose? And second is where do those priorities and where does that purpose meet the needs of the world? And then the third section is how do we actually get there? And one of the things that we're also pioneering, I don't want to sound too Yale's aggrandizing, but one of the needs I've found in the other programs is for opportunities to try on different roles. With young people these days, there's a growth in programs. Northeastern, Drexel are examples of co-op education, work study, where you get to explore, but you also roll up your sleeves and experience those opportunities which seem promising. And so we're going to be building that into the Yale Eli program as well. Throughout, there'll be a strong cohort. So many of the people who've gone through this transition have told me that they feel alone. That do-it-yourself project I was talking about before, well, if you're a part of the Eli program, you won't be doing it alone. There'll be opportunities for life review and memoir writing with Stephanie Dunson at SOM. And there'll be intergenerational opportunities, probably no surprise given what I was just talking about, that are woven throughout the program. Very much hoping to work with First Gen Yale and other programs where young change makers are involved. So I think that this program is breaking a lot of new ground, and the first cohort is going to be a co-creating cohort. We're doing our best to design the program, but I'm sure that there'll be a lot of learning that happens. That's been the case with the peer programs, and so we're looking for a cohort of people who want to help shape this initiative as well as benefit from it.
Well, it's so exciting for us at Yale Alumni Academy because what we're all about is creating lifelong learning experiences for alumni that are learning just for the fun of learning. And we do that across a variety of different sort of accessible points. So we have sessions like this, which are completely free and are all about bringing you the latest scholarship and the latest things happening at Yale Centers of Learning. And we have online educational programs that are paid, but that are still for the love of learning. And we have travel programs. And so the goal is to give someone an entry point no matter where they're coming from. But someone did ask whether or not, if you wanted to apply to the Eli program, whether there was funding available. Are there scholarships? Is that something you've thought about or is coming up in the future?
Yes, there are discounts for Yale alums. So everybody on this call most likely would be eligible for discount. And I do think that there is flexibility. Although I'm talking beyond my role in that, but I do think that is a possibility. One of the things I was going to say that so dovetails with Yale Alumni Academy and the lifelong learning that you were doing is that we're really trying to bring together the best of Yale. Some of the people that I talked about, Becca Levy, will be talking in the opening session. Laurie Santos, Emma Sepola from the School of Management, the Divinity School folks who are working on the Life Worth Living project. Eric Liu, a Yale alum who wrote the book You're More Powerful Than You Think and started Citizens University. So faculty, alumni from Yale. And then we'll also be bringing in the best from outside of Yale throughout the program. So for example, I just did an interview that will be part of the curriculum with Laura Carstensen, who's the founder of the Stanford Center on Longevity that I mentioned earlier. And Laura has done tremendously important research on our priorities in later life. She has something called a theory called socio-emotional selectivity, which sounds very complicated, but what the essence of this her research shows is that as we get to a point in life where there are fewer years ahead than behind, our priorities change. You know, you think if somebody tells you you have a month left to live, you don't think, wow, this would be a great time to learn the oboe or to take up Mandarin. You focus on relationship. And Laura's also shown that in this period of life, we get better at connection and relationship, emotional regulation, empathy grow in later life. And other researchers who will be involved in the program have shown that older people who connect with younger people are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And so there'll be Andrew Scott, who wrote The 100-Year Life, will be involved in the program. So we have some phenomenal people from outside of the university as well as great people within Yale.
Wonderful. Well, I want to, there's a few more questions that are coming in about the program, and I want to direct people, if they have specific questions about the program, to follow the link in the chat, and you will see email contact there where you can send your more detailed questions. And I want to do that because we have a limited time with you, Mark, and we've promised our audience that we will be having an intellectual conversation as well as information about what you're doing. And so there are a few questions that have come up that I think will be interesting to discuss. And I also just had a couple of shout outs that I wanted to give from folks who signed on and introduced themselves in the beginning. I wanted to say there were a few people from Andover Newton Theological School who introduced themselves, and for those who don't know, Andover Newton Seminary has now been folded into Yale Divinity School. So I just thought it was very interesting. We come from all walks of life as a community of alumni, and really interesting how many folks who come from theological backgrounds are thinking about this topic. I also wanted to point out some of the some suggestions for what the third act should be called that come in from the chat. Julie Rickman says that women are living beyond 30, so the age of 60 to 90 can be characterized as the third, was one suggestion that was made there. And then MG Lord suggested, or the ninth life, if you want to go with the feline reference instead of the dog reference that you brought up earlier, Mark. And Esther suggested elders era. So I think, you know, maybe coming out of this first cohort, maybe coming out of this webinar itself, we're going to be able to coin a name for what this third period should be.
Hey, maybe I'll jump in and add a horticultural version. There's a book out now which argues that this period should be called the people in it the perennials.
That's a good one too.
Reblooming. And my friend Chip Conley, who's the founder of MEA, the Modern Elder Academy, and who's been his member of the advisory board for the Yale Life Fellows, is suggests that people in this period should be thinking of themselves as modern elders. He went to Airbnb after having run a boutique hotel company in his 50s, and he discovered that he was part mentor, part intern, and he thought of himself as a mentern, which then he evolved into modern elder, part wise and sage, part beginner mind. So there's also some really interesting ideas for what to call ourselves in this period, as well as what the stage might be called.
Fantastic. This is such an interesting topic. I loved the point that was raised about women's length of life versus men, because women and men do age differently. Just sort of empirically, the data shows us differences, especially as the genders reach later points in life. And Lisa wanted to know if you could address how that affects challenges and opportunities ahead.
It brings up, this is a sideways answer to Lisa's question, but I told that story about the Prudential billboard and the first person to live to 150, and there's been a bet between two scholars of longevity about how long people would live. One of them argues that it is 150. But there's a new article in Nature Aging, the scientific journal, by Jay Olshansky, one of the people in that bet, who is very skeptical that we're going to live to these much longer lives. And his research, which has been covered widely in the press over the last few weeks, is arguing that the maximum human lifespan on average, not for individual people, is 87, with women living longer into their 90s and men shorter. Whether Jay Olshansky and 87 is right or 150, I think what is clear is, first of all, that women are living longer and have even more of an opportunity to have a significant chapter. But somebody who turns 50 really has at least half their adult life in front of them. If he's 20 to 50 is the first half, and 50 to 80 or 87 or into the 90s. So this is a period of life where people can do significant things. And it raises questions about, some people have argued that Social Security should be for young families and that people should work into their 80s. So, I think it's a time to think creatively about what these different parts of the longer life look like.
All right, I want to go to, especially since you said thinking creatively, I believe it's Eileen, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Eileen Walks has asked if you researched how technology can be leveraged to bring the generations together. Is this one of the creative approaches?
I saw during the pandemic, I was struck by how many creative startups focused on technology emerged, connecting grandparents and grandchildren, but also unrelated older and younger people. So I think there is huge possibilities in the realm of technology. This is completely unrelated to that question, but it's something that I wanted to mention earlier, and I think it's really important, is that there's such possibility, not only what the generations can do for each other, but what they can do together. And I just wanted to throw out a couple of pieces of research for the folks tuning in to think about. One is a study from BMW, which tested 3 assembly lines, one of older workers, one of younger workers, and one a mixed line of older and younger workers, and found that the line of older workers, this is kind of vaguely related to technology, but not really, was error-free, but somewhat slow. The line of younger workers was much faster, but beset by errors. And the mixed line of older and younger workers was both fast and error-free. And I think it shows the way that the skills and assets of older and younger people, oftentimes with younger people being more adept with technology and older people having a perspective, Arthur Brooks at the Kennedy School at Harvard has written a book called From Strength to Strength, in which he argues that young people, often associated with technology, are particularly skilled at fluid intelligence, and older people at what he calls crystallized intelligence. And a thriving workplace requires both of those kinds of perspectives. I don't want in any way suggest that older people aren't uh, capable and often skilled at technology, but the assets of the generations do fit together like that jigsaw puzzle I was talking about before.
That's a real argument for changing the way we look at the workplace and the workforce, for sure. I mean, there's been this whole history of like forced retirement. You hit this point in life and then that's it. You need to retire. And some companies even have a designated age at which you have to retire. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
I want to, because I'll give you an example. Thank you, Lauren, for that question. Um, there's an economist at the University of Chicago named David Galenson who studies creativity. Not a lot of economists study creativity, but Galenson has done these studies that he found an auction house in Amsterdam, which has, recorded the value of every significant painting in the last 150 years. And when he did a regression analysis around the value of these paintings, he discovered that genius tended to bloom early and late, and that conceptual genius blooms early. So, Mozart, producing these concertos out of his head at 17, and that what he calls experimental genius, which is based on trial and error, by its very nature blooms late. And he talks about the sculptor Louise Bourgeois, who passed away recently, who was, in her 60s, teaching middle school in Great Neck, New York, having never done anything significant. And her most valuable work was done in her 80s. And Malcolm Gladwell has written about Galenson's research, and he talked about the bands Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. The Eagles have 3 greatest hits albums by the time they're in their early 20s. And Fleetwood Mac fails in 7 different iterations. They try to be an English blues band, and they've got gray hair by the time they do Rumors, and it becomes the biggest selling album of all time. And so there are these different styles that of genius, and I think it's a metaphor for that there's this great talent and youth, this great talent in later life. We tend to overvalue the talent in youth and to write off the talent later on. Gladwell makes that point, when in fact, so many of those people who are being put out to pasture are actually poised to do their greatest work. But this misconception about what people can do at different ages is thwarting that.
And also, right, the internalization of that conception that people have, the idea that people have had that, well, gosh, I'm getting into my 60s now, so it's too late for me to, and you referenced this a little bit earlier, it's too late for me to learn to play the ukulele. I'm never going to be able to put Malcolm Gladwell's, what is it, 10,000 hours of work in, because I'll be dead before that happens. And I think what you're suggesting is completely reframing that, not only for organizations, but for individuals and how they see themselves and their own identities.
We did a prize for social entrepreneurs over the age of 60, people who were doing creative things to solve the big problems of the world. And we wondered whether anybody would actually show up. And the first year we had 5 prizes. We had 1,200 nominations. There were 3 MacArthur Genius Award winners who didn't even make it into the finals. And over the course of 10 years, we had 10,000 nominations of older people who were doing remarkable work. And AARP then took over the Purpose Prize from us. They just completed their 8th year. This past year, I was just at the presentation at the National Portrait Gallery in early October. They had 1,400 nominations they gave out 7 prizes this year. So it's an undiscovered continent of talent, creativity, entrepreneurship, all these things that we tend not to associate with later life.
Well, I sort of was reflecting probably about 10 years ago on the baby boomer generation and how baby boomers in every era of life revolutionized what that era meant. So when baby boomers entered young adulthood, they completely changed the culture, right? And then when they entered midlife, women working became a mainstream thing. And I sort of predicted, when the core volume of baby boomers get into their 60s, we're going to see a complete turning on its head of the concept of retirement and older age. And I wonder if you could speak more to the sort of any research around generational groups and what they bring to the table in this concept.
Yeah, it's so interesting that now I don't know the exact numbers, but now Gen X is moving into their 60s. And the millennials, I think the oldest millennials are they're
They're in their early 40s now.
yes. And which is why I think that the work that people who are on the front end of this age-wise doing is so important, because it's helping to open up possibilities for all of those people who are coming on their heels. And in some ways it reminds me of the role that so many pioneering women played in the 70s and the 80s in opening up new possibilities that were, particularly difficult for them. And I was struck by how, some of the most important books about this period in life have been written by, so Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. One of my longtime board members, absolutely remarkable woman, Suzanne Braun Levine, was the founding editor of Ms. Magazine. And I realized at one point that all of these pioneers, Gloria Steinem has been extraordinarily insightful about this period. That I think there is a connection, to go back to that earlier question about women, um, um, that the pioneers in the women's movement have also been pioneers in aging. And I think, the pioneers in aging are kind of paving the way for all of these younger generations now. That was a roundabout answer, but I highly recommend The Fountain of Age, the Betty Friedan book.
Well, I'm glad you said that. I wanted to acknowledge M.G. Lord from Saybrook, class of 77. I'm not sure if you're still here, but an associate professor at USC and probably best known for their cultural study of the Barbie doll that has been in print for 30 years. And the comment is, I'm now working on something about the loss of third places, how groups like Girl Scouts can contribute to community and the possibility of intergenerational friendships, which I think is an interesting topic to throw into this conversation. But MG Lord actually had a question, and I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to this, but the question is, where did G. Stanley Hall apply, quote unquote, Indian summer to older age? I'm looking for a reference to read more.
Yes, I think it was in the book. Um, I made a lot of his poetic turn, but actually the book he wrote about this period of life has a terrible title. It was called Senescence, and I think it was in that book. And I'm so interested in what MG was talking about with the Girl Scouts and these third places. I mean, I think we need a whole new social infrastructure to facilitate these kinds of cross-generational collaborations. There's some very cool things happening. I'll just mention one example that I think gives people a sense of the possibilities. One of my favorite projects is something that was created by two 20-something MIT city planning grad students called Nesterly. Older people in this country have 54 million spare bedrooms in their houses, and oftentimes they're
Wow.
struggling with chores and loneliness. And so what Nestle started doing in the Boston area, now they've moved to other communities, is matching older people and graduate students in these high cost rental economies to become roommates. And the graduate students do household chores in return for reduced rent, but the real power is not in the efficiency and the economic aspect, it's in the humanity and the relationship building that happens. So I think that there's so many creative things that we could be doing, that would be combine efficiency and humanity in this multi-generational context.
Well, that also sounds like just the kind of project somebody could incubate as a fellow at the Eli in the Eli program, right? I mean, these are the kind of ideas that you can sit with and develop if you have this time and space of a another opportunity at school with resources and professors and interesting peers. So I love that story, Nesterly. Very, very interesting stuff. Um, I want to just kind of highlight, there was a point here in the chat that I think is interesting that Claudia made. Claudia says, I think us older people certainly have a role, but at the same time, it is good to retire in order to leave professional space to younger people. So think, for example, orchestra musicians who hang on to their positions for 60 plus years, not allowing other generations to experience and develop in those positions. And I think like something like this really gets to the heart of your book and this idea of a multi-generational exchange and dialogue. So I wonder if you could comment on Claudia's point.
I'm so glad Claudia made that point because I know I think we've so many of the people that I've talked to, and we've seen it in the political realm in multiple ways, that older people who feel that the two choices are hanging on or the abyss. And we've got to do better than that. There are so many other kinds of much more creative ways to combine the talents of generations. It's not a zero sum arrangement. I'll just tell my own personal story. I'm 66. I didn't want to be one of those people like, the orchestra member who was hanging on. And so I had a kind of heir apparent in my organization, someone I respect enormously, who's a younger woman of color, who is somebody I've worked with for many years. And I asked her if she would be my successor, and she turned me down flat. She said, I've seen you, trying to do this job by yourself, and it hasn't always been the most happiness-inducing experience. But she had a counteroffer, which is to become co-leaders of the organization, and I was so moved by that. I was focused on not wanting to be in the way, and so we've been co-CEOs for the last couple of years, and our focus areas are different, but it's just been great to have someone to share that with. And I think what we discovered is that this co-CEO role is not just a good way to do succession, but it's probably the way we want to have the organization run in an ongoing basis. So when I step aside, I think Eunice, my co-leader, will probably pick a younger person to be her co-CEO.
What a great vision for how organizations just as a whole can evolve and start to think of themselves differently, that leadership can be shared in that way. And another way of bringing sort of diverse talents and points of view into the picture. That's
Yes,
really something different.
I think we really have a failure of imagination about how to do this, which is why I'm so happy about what's happening in the popular culture. So I'm a big fan of the show Hacks, which many of the people on the call will know is it's about a 70 something comedian, played by Gene Smart, who's forced together with a 20 something comedy writer, played by Hannah Einbinder, and they have the same agent, and they've both been canceled, the older one literally and the younger one for an indiscreet tweet. And they are forced together, and they hate each other. But they need each other, and they do actually end up saving their careers, and in the process they form this deep bond, but a complex one. And the New York Times, in reviewing Hacks, described it as a love story disguised as a hate story. And I think that these generational issues, they're love stories and hate stories, really. I mean, there are challenges for sure. And yet there's a way in which we need each other so profoundly. And I think, to go back to the earlier point, I think we need this social infrastructure which enables us to have more love and less hate.
That's a perfect segue onto a comment that Dee Harris made, which I think is fantastic. Two essential parts to communicating across generations: humility and curiosity. And that kind of fits what you were just sort of describing there. I just lost the point, but I want to get back to it because there was more here that was really interesting. Here we go. Humility and curiosity. And Dee says, I've seen so many attempts to bridge the experience of generations fall into challenges. Participants can be overly impressed with the uniqueness of their own experience. I work with young people who complain bitterly of having to listen to elders go on and on. And I honestly can't argue that in many cases. It's something that has to be kept in mind. So, this kind of dealing with the communication divide and also the importance of bringing in humility as a skill set. And I wonder if you could comment on if there's any sort of research or data around how we do that.
Yes, well, it's funny because I think there's some characteristics. I worried even in that BMW study, it reinforces certain stereotypes about what the generations bring. And Eric Liu, who I mentioned earlier, who will be bringing in for the Eli program, who's a Yale alum, says that what we need is the wisdom of the young and the curiosity of the old. And I think when Dee's comment on humility and curiosity made me think of that. And I just wanted to say, we in this Encore Fellows program, we've had 2,600 Encore Fellows, and humility was the most important characteristic of successful Encore Fellows. These are not older people who've come in and said, I've got all the answers, but they were people who came in with a lot of questions. And my mentor, who I mentioned earlier, John Gardner, one of the things I remember he told me, he said that his whole life changed when he realized it was more important to be interested than to be interesting. And I think that's probably something that applies to all stages of life.
Thank you. We have just a couple minutes left, and I think I've covered most all the questions that have come in the chat and the Q&A. I wanted to, unless anybody else has questions, if you have a burning last question, please do put it in the Q&A box. But I wanted to ask one question that I feel like we didn't put enough time to. It's a comment you made earlier about sort of a demonstration that for older people getting involved in, I believe it was the Encore project, that there was data showing that it sort of arrested the development of dementia and possibly, you said, even reversed it. I wonder if you could say more about that. That seems like an undertold story.
Yes, and I think it was shocking, and it's from the research is from Johns Hopkins Medical School, so not exactly a fly-by-night
It's pretty
operation.
legit.
Yeah, one of the co-founders of the project of Experience Corps is Linda Freed, who's the dean of the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. She was at Johns Hopkins when we started it. And I think if you would look beyond those findings, there's more and more evidence around the connection between dementia and social isolation, loss of purpose. And I really think that's probably where that link comes from. And I remember it's kind of reminding me of a story when we started the program. One of the places that it was in is Philadelphia, and I don't know if anybody's watched Abbott Elementary, but one of the schools really I think might be the setting for Abbott Elementary, the Taylor Elementary School in Philadelphia. And one of the Experience Corps members there is a woman named Martha Jones, and she told me this story of getting up on a cold February day and being depressed and pulling the covers back over herself and deciding she was just going to stay at home. And it easily could have been something that spiraled. But as she was in bed, she just realized that if she didn't go into the school, she would be missed, that kids were counting on her. And so she forced herself to get up and get dressed and take the bus in the sleet and the cold. She's walking up the stairs and she goes into, it's a 1920s building, hangs her coat up on a hook. And she recounted feeling these two little arms climbing up behind her, and she just exclaimed in an involuntary way, "Somebody loves me!" And and I think that it's things like that that I think contribute to people through experience core having this buffer against dementia, these ties, this sense reason to get up in the morning, climbing the stairs, having colleagues. So I think it's related to connection and purpose.
Thank you, Mark. I want to give you the opportunity if you have any closing comments that you would like to make. Now's your moment. Anything you want to say before we log off?
Well, I talked before about the intersection between time lived and time left to live. How do we use our experience in this period where we've been given an extra gift of time, but it's going to vanish. But I want to really put in a plug for the time beyond our lives and this idea of leaving a legacy. Erik Erikson, who is one of the great scholars of adult development, said that the hallmark of successful development in this new stage of life that has no name could be encapsulated in the phrase, "I am what survives of me." And I think that we should contemplate those words because I think that this responsibility we have to the period beyond our own time is incredibly important and really important for our own emotional well-being in later life.
I am what survives of me. What a beautiful phrase to end on. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here with us today. I can tell you already there was a clamoring for more presentations from you, so you're welcome back at the Alumni Academy at any time. Our guest today was Mark Friedman, lecturer in the practice of management at the Yale School of Management and faculty co-director of the new Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative. I have put the link in the chat for those of you who want to learn more. I do encourage you, take a look at the application process. This might be the right thing for you. If you want to read more about what Mark has presented about, his book is called How to Live Forever: The Enduring Power of Connecting the Generations. He has also assigned some readings for all of us here today who want to read more. They're available on the Yale Alumni Academy website, the page dedicated to this presentation. And all of you will get an email link with that web page, a link for the Experienced Leaders Initiative, and a recording of this presentation so that you can share it with family and friends and other Yaleys who couldn't make it today. I'm Lauren Summers. I'm looking forward to seeing you the next time. We will be back in November with our Climate Change Conversations series. So please look out for emails about that. And thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It was a joy.
All right, same here. Bye-bye, everyone.